The boardroom fell silent when the three men in dress blues walked through the mahogany doors. Zara Akafer didn't look up from her quarterly reports, her Mont Blanc pen scratching precise notes across the financial projections that would determine whether her aerospace company secured another billion-dollar defense contract. The silence stretched until she felt their presence like gravity itself had shifted in the room. "Ma'am," the tallest one said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and something else, something that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "We need to speak with you about Operation Blackwater." The pen stopped moving. For 17 years, Zara had buried that name so deep that hearing it felt like archaeological excavation of her own soul. She set down the Mont Blanc with the deliberate care of someone defusing a bomb, her manicured fingers betraying nothing of the tremor that wanted to surface. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan penthouse office, helicopters dotted the skyline like mechanical birds of prey, but none of them made her pulse quicken the way it was racing now. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, finally looking up. Her voice carried the cultivated authority of boardrooms and Senate hearings, but these weren't senators or shareholders. These were operators, and the way they stood, weight-balanced, eyes scanning, hands positioned for quick movement, told her everything she needed to know about why they'd found her after all these years. The middle one, a commander judging by his ribbons, placed a manila folder on her desk. The sound it made hitting the polished surface was softer than paper should be, muffled by whatever photographs or documents lay inside. "Lieutenant Commander Zara Phoenix Akafer," he said, and hearing her call sign spoken aloud after nearly 2 decades felt like being struck by lightning. "Missing in action, Somalia 2007. Presumed dead after your Seahawk went down during extraction of SEAL Team 6. She stared at the folder, knowing that opening it would unravel the life she'd built from nothing, the empire she'd constructed from government contracts and military connections that ironically stemmed from the very mission these men were here to discuss. The woman who'd clawed her way from presumed dead Navy pilot to billionaire defense contractor was about to confront the ghost she'd thought she'd successfully buried in the African desert. "You were never just missing," the third man said quietly. "You were commanding that operation." The afternoon sun caught the silver of her company's logo on the wall behind her, a phoenix rising from flames. She'd thought herself clever when she'd chosen it, a private joke about resurrection and second chances. Now it felt like prophecy or perhaps confession. The revelation hanging in the air between them would either destroy everything she'd built or finally explain how a dead woman had become one of the most powerful people in American defense contracting. Her empire was built on a secret that was about to surface. Zara's fingers found the thin scar along her hairline, a habit she developed during the early days of building Akafer Aerospace, when venture capitalists would lean back in their leather chairs and ask how a young black woman planned to compete in the defense industry. She'd learned to touch that scar when she needed to remember what she was capable of, what she'd survived. Now, with these 3 SEALs staring at her across 12 feet of imported marble, that small reminder felt insufficient. "Gentlemen," she said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace that 17 years of success had taught her to weaponize. "I appreciate your visit, but as I said, you have the wrong person. I've never served in any military capacity. I'm simply a businesswoman who happens to work with defense contractors." The commander opened the folder anyway. The first photograph slid across her desk like an accusation, a younger version of herself in desert camouflage, helmet tilted at an angle that had earned her more reprimands than she could count, standing beside a modified MH-60S Seahawk. The aircraft's nose art was visible in the image, a stylized phoenix with wings spread wide, painted in defiant orange and red against the military gray. "You painted that bird yourself," the tallest SEAL said, and it wasn't a question. "Against regulations, but nobody cared because you could make that Seahawk dance like it was part of your body." The photograph triggered a cascade of memories she'd spent years learning to suppress. The weight of night vision goggles pressing against her skull, the vibration of rotor wash thrumming through her bones, the absolute trust in her voice when she'd called "feet wet" over the radio signaling safe passage over water. She remembered the smell of aviation fuel mixed with desert air, the way her crew chief Martinez had always tapped the hull twice for luck before missions, the coffee that tasted like motor oil but kept them functional during 18-hour days. "That woman died in Somalia," Zara said finally, but her voice had lost some of its boardroom authority. "Whatever you think you know about some pilot named Phoenix." "Phoenix didn't die in Somalia." The third SEAL stepped forward, and she could see now that he was older than the others, his face carrying the kind of lines that came from decisions made in darkness. "Phoenix disappeared for 17 years and built a billion-dollar empire. The question we're here to ask is why you felt the need to fake your own death." Outside, a news helicopter banked around the building, its rotors churning the air into visible distortions against the blue sky. Zara found herself tracking its movement with the automatic precision of someone who'd once calculated wind speed and approach angles as naturally as breathing. The pilot was good, smooth transitions, no wasted motion. But she could see 3 adjustments she would have made to optimize the flight path. Some skills never left you, no matter how long you tried to bury them. The scar along her hairline pulsed with phantom pain, reminding her of the crash that had supposedly killed Lieutenant Commander Phoenix, but had somehow delivered Zara Akafer to a new life. She'd never planned to become a billionaire. She'd planned to complete the mission, extract the team, and file her after-action report like she had dozens of times before. Instead, she'd woken up in a field hospital with no memory of the past week and military personnel who seemed oddly eager to declare her dead. Now these 3 men were here to excavate a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to remember, let alone share. But the folder on her desk seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets that had been buried long enough. Soon, she would have to choose between the empire she'd built and the woman she'd once been. The choice, she was beginning to realize, might not be hers to make. The manila folder seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, its contents spreading across Zara's desk like evidence at a crime scene. More photographs emerged. Aerial shots of a compound in Somalia, tactical briefings with faces she recognized despite 17 years of trying to forget them. And finally, a grainy satellite image that made her breath catch in her throat. It showed the wreckage of her Seahawk, twisted metal scattered across desert sand like the bones of some prehistoric creature. But what made her hands clench into fists wasn't the destruction, it was what wasn't in the photograph. No bodies, no blood, no sign that anyone had died in that crash, despite the official reports that had declared her entire crew casualties of war. "You extracted the team," the commander said, sliding another document across the desk. "All 12 SEALs made it home alive because you kept that bird in the air 40 seconds longer than physics said it should fly. The enemy RPG that took you down, it was meant for the ground team. You drew their fire." Zara stared at the commendation letter she'd never received, signed by officers whose names she'd spent years learning not to remember. The words blurred together, but certain phrases stood out like accusations. Extraordinary heroism under fire, saved 12 lives at significant personal risk, recommended for Distinguished Flying Cross. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her was beginning to understand all too well. "If I saved the team, why was I declared dead? Why wasn't I evacuated with the others?" The 3 SEALs exchanged glances, the kind of weighted communication that happened between operators who'd shared foxholes and secrets. The oldest one, the one with the lined face, leaned forward and placed his hands on the desk with deliberate care. "Because Lieutenant Commander Phoenix discovered something in that compound that certain people didn't want her to report. Something worth making her disappear for." The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, casting longer shadows across the office. Zara's empire felt suddenly fragile, built as it was on the foundation of a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. She thought about the years of carefully cultivated relationships with Pentagon officials, the defense contracts that had made her fortune, the way doors opened when she walked into rooms full of military brass who seemed to know her reputation without her ever having to explain it. They'd known, somehow some of them had always known who she really was. "What did I find?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. The commander pulled out a tablet and showed her a classified file with redactions thick as black paint. What little text remained visible painted a picture of weapons trafficking, illegal arms sales, and American military equipment ending up in enemy hands through channels that led directly back to certain defense contractors. Contractors who had been competing for the same billion-dollar deals that had built Zara's empire. "You found proof that someone in our chain of command was selling weapons to the same insurgents we were fighting. American soldiers were dying from bullets fired by guns we'd sold to their killers." The revelation hit her like rotor wash from a departing helicopter, violent and disorienting. She remembered fragments now, encrypted communications intercepts, serial numbers that didn't match manifests, the way her commanding officer had seemed unusually interested in the details of her reconnaissance flights over arms depot locations. She'd been investigating corruption in the defense industry for 17 years, building her empire while hunting the very people who'd tried to have her killed. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. "Who?" she asked, her voice dropping to the whisper she'd once used during night insertions when sound discipline meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "That," said the 3rd SEAL, "is why we're here." The tablet screen flickered as the commander scrolled through files, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy that had cost Phoenix her identity and given birth to Zara Akafer. Names began to emerge from the redacted text, some of them sickeningly familiar. Board members of rival defense companies, Pentagon officials she'd shaken hands with at military charity galas. The very people who'd smiled and congratulated her on her success. never knowing they were celebrating the survival of someone they'd tried to eliminate. Admiral Harrison Vick, the commander said, and the name hit Zara like a physical blow. She knew that name. She just had lunch with Admiral Vick the previous week, discussing a potential joint venture between their companies. He'd complimented her vision for next-generation attack helicopters, praised her understanding of military requirements that seemed almost intuitive. Because it was intuitive, because she'd flown those missions, faced that enemy fire, understood exactly what pilots needed to survive in hostile airspace. Her success hadn't been built on business acumen alone. It had been built on the tactical knowledge of a combat veteran who'd never been allowed to claim that experience publicly. Vic ordered the strike that brought down your bird, the second SEAL said, but he didn't count on you surviving the crash. When you turned up 3 weeks later in that field hospital with amnesia and no identification, it seemed like a gift from Providence. Dead pilots don't file reports. Dead pilots don't testify before Congress. The scar along her hairline throbbed as more memories began to surface, fragmented but insistent. She remembered walking through desert sand, her flight suit torn and bloody, clutching something in her hands. A hard drive, she realized now. Evidence that could have ended careers and sent powerful men to prison if anyone had been alive to present it. I buried the evidence, she whispered, the memory coming back in pieces like shrapnel working its way to the surface. Before the rescue patrol found me, I buried it because I didn't know who to trust. The 3 SEALs leaned forward as one, predators scenting blood in the water. Ma'am, the commander said, and his voice carried 17 years of patience finally reaching its end. We need to know where you put it, because Admiral Vick is about to be nominated for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and if that happens, the same corruption that tried to kill you will be running the entire American military. The weight of 17 years crashed down on her shoulders like a collapsing building. Every contract she'd won, every relationship she'd built, every dollar in her empire, all of it suddenly made sense in a way that was both vindicating and terrifying. She hadn't just survived her own assassination. She'd spent nearly 2 decades unknowingly positioning herself to finish the mission that had nearly gotten her killed. Outside her windows, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky the colors of fire and combat. Phoenix was about to rise from the ashes one more time. The silence in the boardroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of revelation. Zara closed her eyes and let the memories flow back, each one sharp and clear as the moment they'd been forged in desert heat and mortal terror. She remembered the compound in Somalia, remembered the way the intelligence didn't match what she'd seen from the air, remembered the sick feeling in her stomach when she'd realized the weapons cache they were supposed to destroy contained American serial numbers. Grid coordinates 02 degrees 0315, 6N 45 degrees 2148 2E, she said without opening her eyes. Buried 18 inches down, wrapped in plastic, marked with 3 stones arranged in a triangle. The commander was already pulling up satellite maps on his tablet, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. That's 40 kilometers southwest of Mogadishu, right where your Seahawk went down. Not where it went down, Zara corrected, finally opening her eyes. Where I crashed it on purpose, after I'd copied everything I needed from their servers and realized the extraction zone was compromised. The memory was crystalline now, every detail etched in combat clarity. I had maybe 90 seconds between the RPG hit and total hydraulic failure. Enough time to send a coded transmission and put that bird down where I wanted it, not where physics demanded. She rose from her chair and walked to the windows, looking out over the city that had become her kingdom built on secrets and survivors' guilt. I've been having nightmares about that crash for 17 years. Turns out they weren't nightmares. They were mission debriefs my subconscious was trying to conduct. The oldest SEAL joined her at the window. His reflection in the glass showed a face that had seen too much and forgotten too little, not unlike her own. Ma'am, with respect, that evidence has been sitting in Somali desert for 17 years. What makes you think it's still recoverable? Zara smiled, and for the first time since these 3 men had walked into her office, it was the smile of Lieutenant Commander Phoenix, not billionaire Zara Akafer. Because I didn't just bury a hard drive, Chief. I buried it inside a crash-survivable flight recorder housing, rated for impact, fire, and submersion. The kind they put in aircraft that might need to tell their story after the pilots can't. She turned back to face them, and they could see in her eyes the predatory calculation that had once made her one of the Navy's most requested insertion pilots. That data has been waiting 17 years for someone to come dig it up. Question is, are you gentlemen prepared for what happens when we prove that the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to have a Navy pilot assassinated to cover up his arms-dealing operation? The commander was already on his secure satellite phone, speaking in the clipped professional tones of someone calling in favors from very high places. The second SEAL was photographing documents with a camera that looked distinctly more sophisticated than civilian technology. The third was staring at Zara with something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we've been looking for Phoenix for 15 years. Not to arrest her, not to debrief her, but to recruit her. There are some missions that require someone who's already dead." The implications of that statement settled over the room like cordite smoke. Zara understood now why they'd found her, why they'd revealed themselves after all these years of careful invisibility. They hadn't come here to expose her. They'd come here to collect her. "What kind of missions?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The kind that require someone with no official existence, unlimited resources, and a very personal interest in cleaning up corruption in the defense establishment." The commander had finished his phone call and was looking at her with the focused intensity of a targeting system locking on. The kind that a dead Navy pilot might be uniquely qualified to handle. Outside, the city lights were beginning to flicker on as darkness fell across Manhattan. Somewhere in the growing shadows, Admiral Vic was probably reviewing his confirmation hearing preparation, secure in the knowledge that all witnesses to his crimes were safely buried in African sand. He had no way of knowing that one of those witnesses had spent 17 years building the resources and connections necessary to destroy him. Phoenix had been patient, but now it was time to hunt. The secure phone rang 3 times before a voice Zara recognized from classified briefings answered. "This is Admiral Rebecca Torres, Special Operations Command. I'm told you have something that belongs to us." Zara looked at the 3 SEALs, at the evidence spread across her desk, at the empire she'd built from the ashes of her own supposed death. "Admiral Torres, this is Lieutenant Commander Zara Okafor, call sign Phoenix. I'm calling to report for duty." The pause on the other end of the line stretched for exactly 17 years, compressed into 15 seconds of absolute silence. When Torres spoke again, her voice carried the weight of recognition, relief, and something that sounded remarkably like pride. "Welcome back from the dead, Phoenix. We have work to do." The transformation began immediately. Within 6 hours of that phone call, Zara's penthouse office had become an operational command center that would have impressed her former squadron commanders. Maps of Somalia covered her conference table. Satellite images flickered across multiple screens. Communication equipment that definitely wasn't civilian-grade hummed quietly in corners where modern art had stood that morning. The 3 SEALs had been joined by a dozen others, each one carrying credentials that didn't officially exist and authority that came from somewhere deeper than the Pentagon's organizational chart. They moved through her space with the fluid efficiency of operators who'd worked together before, setting up what one of them called a little black op infrastructure. Zara found herself slipping back into patterns she'd thought were lost forever. She thought in mission parameters again, calculated risk assessments with variables that included body counts and collateral damage. When the communications specialist asked about secure uplink protocols, she rattled off frequency modulation specifications she hadn't consciously remembered knowing. "It's like riding a bicycle," the chief had said, watching her review satellite reconnaissance data with eyes that missed nothing. "Some things you don't forget." "Some things," Zara had replied, "don't let you forget them." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. A small team would deploy to Somalia under non-official cover, retrieve the buried evidence, and return with proof that would end Admiral Vic's career and expose a corruption network that had been killing American soldiers for over a decade. Standard black operations protocol, the kind of mission that had been run thousands of times in dozens of countries. Except this time, the primary asset was a billionaire defense contractor who'd been legally dead for 17 years and had more to lose than anyone else in the room. "Ma'am," the commander said as the briefing concluded, "I need to be clear about something. Once we start this operation, there's no going back. Your identity, your company, your entire life as Zara Okafor becomes part of the mission file. Are you prepared for that level of exposure?" She thought about her corporate board, about the shareholders who trusted her with their investments, about the employees who depended on her company for their livelihoods. Then she thought about the 12 SEALs she'd saved in Somalia, about the American soldiers who died from weapons sold by the very corruption she was about to expose, about the 17 years she'd spent building an empire on the foundation of her own supposed death. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd already died once and wasn't afraid to do it again, "I've been preparing for this mission for 17 years. The only question is whether your boys can keep up with me." The laughter that followed was the kind shared by warriors who'd found their tribe, predators who'd identified their prey, professionals who understood that they were about to attempt something that would either make history or get them all killed. Phoenix was officially back in the game. The deployment timeline was aggressive even by special operations standards. 72 hours from briefing to wheels up, with mission parameters that read like something from a thriller novel. Zara spent the first 24 hours transferring operational control of her company to her CFO with explanations that wouldn't satisfy anyone but would have to suffice. The corporate world could survive without her for a few weeks. The mission couldn't survive without Phoenix. Her apartment had been transformed into a staging area that looked nothing like the designer showcase it had been a week earlier. Body armor replaced evening gowns in her closet. Night vision equipment occupied the space where crystal sculptures had once reflected Manhattan's lights. The woman who'd built a fortune from defense contracts was remembering what those contracts were actually designed to create. "Ma'am, you need to see this." The communications specialist handed her a tablet showing intercepts from Admiral Vic's personal communications. The messages were encrypted, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was asking questions about Somalia, about missing records, about a certain Navy pilot who'd supposedly died in a crash 17 years earlier. Zara studied the data with eyes that had once analyzed enemy communication patterns for signs of imminent attack. The timestamps, the frequency, the routing protocols, all of it suggested that Vic knew something was wrong. He was hunting for ghosts, not realizing that one of them was about to become very, very real. "He's scared," she said finally. "Whatever contacts he still has in theater, they're telling him someone's been asking about that compound, about the crash site." The commander looked up from his own tablet, where he'd been reviewing extraction protocols with the kind of focus that suggested he expected to need them. How scared? Scared enough to risk exposing himself by making inquiries, scared enough to use channels he's avoided for nearly 2 decades. She scrolled through more intercepts, each one painting a picture of a man watching carefully constructed lies begin to unravel. He knows we're coming. The mission parameters shifted immediately. What had been planned as a simple retrieval operation became something considerably more complex. A race against time to recover evidence before it could be destroyed, with the additional complication that their target might be actively working to eliminate any proof of his crimes. "New timeline," the commander announced to the assembled team. "Wheels up in 18 hours. Full kit, desert configuration, prepared for hostile contact." Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before dangerous missions. The hyper-awareness that turned ordinary sounds into potential threats and made every shadow worth investigating. She'd forgotten how much she'd missed that feeling, the absolute clarity that came when survival depended on split-second decisions and perfect execution. Her hands moved automatically to check gear that wasn't there yet, muscle memory from thousands of pre-flight inspections. Tomorrow she would be back in the cockpit of a military aircraft, flying toward the place where Lieutenant Commander Phoenix had supposedly died. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. "Phoenix," the chief's voice cut through her reverie, "you good to go?" She looked around the room at the faces of men who'd volunteered to follow a dead woman into hostile territory to recover evidence that might not exist anymore, all to stop a corruption scandal that could reshape the American military hierarchy. They were trusting her with their lives based on memories that had been buried for 17 years and tactical skills she hadn't used since the world was a different place. "Chief," she said, and her voice carried the absolute confidence that had once made 12 Navy SEALs trust her to fly them home through enemy fire. "I was born ready." The C-130 Hercules lifted off from a runway that didn't officially exist, carrying passengers whose names weren't on any manifest, bound for a destination that wouldn't appear in any flight log. Zara sat in the cargo bay wearing desert camouflage that felt like coming home, surrounded by equipment that had been designed by companies she now competed with and weapons that had been purchased through contracts she now negotiated. The circular nature of it all was almost poetic. 30 minutes to drop zone," the loadmaster called out over the engine noise. Around her, the SEALs began their final equipment checks with the methodical precision of men who'd done this dance more times than they could count. Zara found herself falling into the rhythm automatically, fingers moving over gear with the sure knowledge of where everything needed to be. The chief handed her a headset that connected her to the aircraft's communication system. Through the crackling static, she heard the voices of pilots discussing weather conditions, wind speed, approach vectors, the familiar language of people who made their living in 3 dimensions. For the first time in 17 years, she was part of that conversation again. "Phoenix, this is Dustoff 77. We've got your insertion point marked and secure. Weather looks good, minimal wind, excellent visibility." Hearing her call signs spoken over military radio frequencies felt like touching an exposed nerve. She keyed her microphone and responded in the clipped professional tone she'd learned before most of these operators had joined the service. "Dustoff 77, Phoenix copies. Request approach vector and terrain assessment." The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough for the pilots to realize they were talking to someone who knew what questions to ask. When the response came, it carried a different tone, the respect that aviators reserved for other aviators who'd proven themselves under fire. Phoenix, approach vector 090, terrain flat and sandy, no obstacles visible from altitude. Ma'am, it's an honor to provide transport for someone with your reputation. Reputation. She wondered what stories had been told about Lieutenant Commander Phoenix in the years since her supposed death, what legends had grown around a pilot who'd managed to extract an entire SEAL team despite catastrophic aircraft damage. Military culture thrived on such stories, passing them from generation to generation like tactical DNA. All right, people, the commander's voice cut through her reflection. 5 minutes to drop, remember we're ghosts until we're not. Minimal footprint, maximum efficiency, home by dawn. Zara felt the familiar premission calm descend over her, the hyper-awareness that came when everything unnecessary fell away and only the essential remained. In 5 minutes, she would be back in Somalia, back at the place where Phoenix had died and Zara Akafar had been born. The woman who'd spent 17 years building an empire was about to discover whether the warrior she'd buried in desert sand could still do the job she'd been trained for. The aircraft began its descent toward coordinates that had haunted her dreams for nearly 2 decades. Below them, the Somali desert stretched endlessly in all directions, hiding secrets that were about to be excavated by people who understood that some truths were worth dying for. Phoenix was coming home to collect her ghosts. The drop zone materialized out of darkness like a memory becoming real. Zara hit the ground with muscle memory that 17 years hadn't erased, rolling to absorb impact and coming up in a crouch with her weapon ready. Around her, the SEALs spread out in a perimeter that could have been drawn with mathematical precision, each man covering a sector that overlapped with his teammates in layers of protective observation. The desert was exactly as she remembered, endless, hostile, and beautiful in its simplicity. Sand stretched toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant, broken only by rock formations that looked like ancient sculptures carved by wind and time. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that made every footstep sound like thunder and every breath seem dangerously loud. "Phoenix, you've got point," the commander whispered into his throat mic. "Take us home." Home, the word felt strange applied to a place where she'd almost died, but Zara understood what he meant. This wasn't just navigation, it was pilgrimage, a return to the moment when one life had ended and another had begun. She closed her eyes and let 17-year-old memories guide her feet, feeling for landmarks that existed more in her bones than in her conscious mind. The wreckage appeared first as a shadow against stars, then as twisted metal that caught moonlight in ways that hurt to look at. Her Seahawk had aged badly in the desert, reduced to a skeleton of corroded aluminum and steel that barely resembled the aircraft that had once danced through hostile airspace at her command. But even in death, it was beautiful, a monument to the moment when Lieutenant Commander Phoenix had chosen duty over survival and paid the price in full. "Jesus," one of the SEALs whispered. "You really did thread the needle, crashed it exactly where you wanted it." Zara approached the wreckage with the reverence reserved for gravesites and battlefields. She could see now what the satellite images hadn't shown, the way the aircraft had been positioned to shield the crew compartment from the explosion, the deliberate nature of an impact that had looked random from altitude. She'd piloted a dying aircraft with surgical precision, using her last moments of control to save lives even as her own seemed to be ending. "Grid coordinates 02 degrees 0315, 6N45 degrees 2148 2E, she murmured, consulting the GPS device strapped to her wrist. 18 inches down, 3 stones arranged in a triangle. The burial site was 50 meters from the crash, marked exactly as she'd remembered. The stones hadn't moved, despite 17 years of desert wind and the occasional sandstorm that could reshape landscapes overnight. Looking at them, she felt the weight of time compress into a single moment of absolute clarity. The chief handed her an entrenching tool without being asked. The first bite into desert sand felt like archaeology in reverse, not uncovering the past but recovering it. Each shovelful revealed more of a secret that had been waiting patiently for someone to come dig it up. At exactly 18 inches, her shovel struck something that didn't belong in natural sand. The crash-survivable flight recorder housing had protected its contents better than she'd dared hope. Wrapped in layers of plastic and sealed against moisture, the hard drive inside looked almost new despite its underground hibernation. But it was the second item in the cache that made her hands tremble as she lifted it into moonlight. Her original mission notes, handwritten on waterproof paper in the careful block letters that had been drilled into every military aviator since flight training began. Grid coordinates, serial numbers, personnel identification codes, Everything a pilot needed to file a complete after-action report on an operation that had gone sideways in ways that still hadn't been fully explained. Ma'am, the communications specialist was already unpacking his portable satellite uplink. We need to verify this data before we move, if it's corrupted or incomplete. It's not corrupted, Zara interrupted, her voice carrying absolute certainty. I was trained by people who didn't believe in half measures. That drive contains enough evidence to end careers and start congressional investigations. The question is whether we're prepared for what happens when we hand it over. The commander was studying his watch, calculating timelines with the precision of someone who'd learned that missions succeeded or failed based on minutes and seconds. Extraction in 4 hours. We verify the data, confirm it's actionable, and disappear before anyone knows we were here. But even as he spoke, they could all hear it. The distant sound of rotors cutting through desert air growing louder with each passing second. Someone else was coming to the crash site, and given the timing, it wasn't a coincidence. Admiral Zwick had found them. The helicopter sounds multiplied as Zara's team scrambled for defensive positions around the wreckage. 3 aircraft, approaching from different vectors with the coordinated precision of a tactical formation. Through her night vision goggles, she could see them as heat signatures against the cooling desert sky. Military helicopters, probably Somali government forces, but flying with American-trained precision. So much for operational security, the chief muttered, settling behind a piece of twisted rotor blade that provided decent cover. Someone leaked our timeline. Zara was analyzing the approaching aircraft with eyes that had once calculated threat assessments as naturally as breathing. Those are Mi-24 Hinds, probably purchased through American military aid programs, but they're flying American attack patterns using American communication protocols. She paused as radio chatter crackled through her headset, and they're speaking English. The implications hung in the desert air like cordite smoke. This wasn't just enemy contact, it was American military personnel, operating under questionable authorization, attempting to recover the same evidence that Zara's team had come to retrieve. The corruption they were investigating had grown tentacles that reached further than anyone had imagined. Phoenix, the commander's voice, was calm despite their deteriorating tactical situation. You know these aircraft better than anyone. What are our options? She studied the approaching formation with the clinical detachment that had once made her one of the Navy's most requested pilots. The lead aircraft was maintaining a search pattern that would bring it directly over their position within minutes. The 2 wingmen were establishing a perimeter that would prevent ground escape. Textbook encirclement tactics, executed with American training and American equipment. They're good, she admitted, but they're flying by the book, and the book assumes they're hunting insurgents, not former military personnel who helped write that book. The crash survivable recorder felt impossibly heavy in her hands, 17 years of buried truth compressed into a device smaller than a paperback novel. Everything she'd built as Zara Akafer, everything she'd sacrificed as Lieutenant Commander Phoenix, had led to this moment in the desert where the past was finally catching up with the present. Chief, she said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible, how do you feel about stealing a helicopter? The expression on his face could have powered a small city. Ma'am, I feel like that's exactly the kind of crazy-ass plan that separates legends from statistics. The first Mi-24 touched down 200 meters from the crash site, disgorging personnel who moved with American military precision but wore no visible identification. Zara counted 8 operators, all carrying weapons that had been purchased with taxpayer money to fight terrorists, now being used to suppress evidence of corruption at the highest levels of military command. Remember, she whispered to her team as they prepared to move, these are American soldiers following orders from someone who's convinced them they're protecting national security. Non-lethal if possible, but don't get killed trying to be polite. The desert had taught her patience, but 17 years was long enough to wait. Lieutenant Commander Phoenix was about to remind the world why.